On Ukraine, Europeans, in my view, constitute what I call the coalition of the deluded. That is to say, they have no wherewithal with which to actually enable Ukraine to even defend itself effectively, let alone take back the territories it's lost. Their motive is anti-Russian, not pro-Ukrainian. They have put forward absolutely no peace proposal at all. Every proposal they put forward is a proposal to continue the war or escalate it. And now the United States has very cleverly handed off the Ukraine war to the Europeans.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Ambassador Chas Freeman, a former US diplomat and Assistant Secretary of Defense. Ambassador Freeman, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be with you, Pascal.
Well, thank you very much for saying yes. Just before we started, I said that you always help us make sense of where we are in the process of global change. And one of the changes we've seen recently is that your former position as Assistant Secretary of Defense is now called Assistant Secretary of War. What do you make out of this idea of changing the Department of Defense, the naming back into Department of War?
Well, it's an absurd change, of course, and it reflects nostalgia for a bygone age, which wasn't experienced by President Trump, but which he exalts, and that is the age of McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt, when the United States was very assertive militarily. And there does seem to be something to this, in the sense that the only serious strategist in the Trump administration, Elbridge Colby, who is the author of the forthcoming National Security Strategy paper, is apparently thinking about removing the American presence outside the Western Hemisphere, or at least de-emphasizing it, and restoring the Monroe Doctrine in its second incarnation. Of course, that was proclaimed in about 1820, when the United States didn't have the capacity to enforce hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. We depended on the British Navy to do that. But at the end of the century, we had become the largest economy on the planet and unchallenged within the hemisphere. And so the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine kicked in. And interestingly, all of this was catalyzed by a crisis with Venezuela, which seems to be a perpetual obsession of the United States and others. We actually, in about 1898, I think, got into a discussion with the British, who had proposed to intervene in Venezuela for two reasons. One, uncollected debt from the Venezuelans, and the second, a dispute over the Venezuelan boundary, the frontier, the border with British Guyana, now Guyana, an independent country. That dispute has not been resolved and is currently alive and well. That is a squabble over natural resources within the disputed border. But basically, the United States warned the British that if they were to do what they proposed to do, we would go to war with them. And that catalyzed a discussion in London of what would a war with the United States mean in 1898, 99, 1900. And the British military establishment concluded that it would mean the loss of Canada as a dominion, and that this was not worth it. And so they then appeased the United States very skillfully on two issues. One was abrogating, doing away with a treaty called the Bulwer-Lytton Treaty, which prohibited the United States from building a canal across Central America, and enabled the British to block what became the Panama Canal. That was replaced. Teddy Roosevelt engineered the secession of what is now Panama from Colombia, and the British responded by developing a new treaty which gave the United States the right to build a canal. And of course, the French, de Lesseps and others, had been the investors in a canal in the Panamanian Isthmus. They were forced out. The second thing that happened was that the dispute between the United States and Canada over where the border on the Pacific coast of Canada was, with the United States claiming what is now the panhandle of Alaska, and the Canadians claiming quite reasonably, I think, that the area north of Vancouver should be Canadian rather than American, was submitted to an arbitral tribunal, one British representative, one American, one Canadian, and the Brit was instructed to vote for the United States in order to appease us. And that is the explanation for why the capital of the state of Alaska is in Juneau, in a little fringe along the Pacific coast, and why the coast north of British Columbia in Canada is American, not Canadian. And this all worked very well because appeasement is sometimes a successful diplomatic strategy. That is, if the country being appeased is fairly limited in its ambitions, unlike Hitler, who was unlimited in his ambitions. And it had a lot to do with the United States entering World War I on the side of the British rather than the Germans, because there was no sympathy in the United States then for Great Britain. British were widely disliked. The main political game of American politicians was twisting the lion's tail, as it was called. We have actually in the United States more people with German surnames than we do with English surnames. And so in my own family, my grandfather, who had run away from his very famous professor father at the University of Chicago and joined the Illinois cavalry to fight Pancho Villa, a Mexican revolutionary who had crossed the border with the United States and chased Pancho Villa all over northern Mexico. He was nationalized, or his unit was nationalized and sent to Britain, preparatory to going onto the continent. And there were great squabbles with the British, but they had basically got us into the war with an intelligence false flag, which was the so-called Zimmerman telegram, a telegram which they had concocted, which appeared to be from Berlin, offering Mexico the western part of the United States back if they would join Germany in the war. This was, of course, entirely false, concocted by MI6, but it was sufficient to alarm people and get us into the war. So this is all very complicated, but it's so interesting that the status of Venezuela, its boundaries, its relationship with other countries, and so forth, is once again in the headlines.
Yeah, and we underestimate this the impact of these very long-standing feuds, right, over disputed places. I mean, politically disputed. We see it also with how the United States for 60 years has been treating Cuba. But when it comes to Venezuela, do you think that currently the military buildup in the Caribbean, has to be interpreted as a preparation to actually do war? I mean, the United States now blew up a second ship that they claim was a Venezuelan drug ship, but without. I mean, there's no way we can check on that, right? We have to take the word of the U.S. for that is true, and even if that's true, it would still be a huge breach of maritime law. But what do you think is going on there?
Well, I don't think it's preparatory to an invasion. But I think it is part of a long-standing 21st century effort to overthrow the government of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, the heir to President Chavez, Hugo Chavez Frias, the founder of the Bolivarian idea in the last century. Simon Bolivar was a remarkable man whose ambition and whose anger at the contempt that Spanish colonial residents of Venezuela and Colombia, which were then called Gran Colombia, his anger at second-class treatment inspired him to lead an effective revolt against Spanish rule in South America. And he's a great figure. And Hugo Chavez Frias, the president earlier, before Nicolas Maduro, appropriated Bolivar as a hero and as the inspiration for quite a different ideology, which was left-wing and very much associated with Cuba. So the Bolivarian idea, which inspired a coup d'etat, an attempted coup d'etat by Hugo Chavez Frias, which failed, and then an eventual succession to the presidency of Venezuela, was a socialist ideology, and it involved a close association with Cuba. And of course, the United States is home to a large number of Cuban refugees, immigrants from Cuba, one of whom is now our Secretary of State. This Cuban community in the United States, until very recently at least, was united in its desire to overthrow the regime of Fidel Castro in Cuba. And by extension, they opposed two other countries in the region, Venezuela and Nicaragua, both of which had close relations with Cuba. Cuba, for a time during the Cold War, was not only allied with the Soviet Union, which inspired American opposition to it on strategic grounds, but it was also exporting revolution. It now exports doctors, which is a much better thing to export. But Venezuela got caught in the anti-Cuban crossfire, in effect, and it became very dependent on Cuba, and vice versa. Cuban oil supplies, after the Soviet Union collapsed, came from Venezuela. The Cuban presence, training the Venezuelan armed forces, providing medical care in Venezuela, influencing Venezuelan politics was very strong. And this is anathema to the United States, and particularly to that special interest that I mentioned, the Cuban-American community. So this has a deep history recently, but as I indicated, our problems with Venezuela and its status and its behavior go back a very long way.
So yesterday, Marco Rubio actually, or the day before yesterday, he in a TV announcement, he said that Nicolas Maduro was not the president of Venezuela, that 50 or so countries don't recognize him as such, that he is just the leader of a cartel. And this all sounds as if though the ground is being prepared to make a legal argument that this man himself can be taken out, because we have seen now recently this decapitation strike strategy of Israel and the United States in West Asia. And there's people who fear that this might now be extended to Venezuela, and that the United States will not put boots on the ground, but that they will try to lure Maduro to a place where they know where he is, and then boom, and then you have the regime change necessarily. Is that a fear that you also have?
It is a justified apprehension. There's been a $50 million bounty put on Nicolas Maduro's head, dead or alive. So very clearly the Trump administration, and I think Marco Rubio in particular, are trying very hard to engineer regime change in Caracas. I don't think there's much evidence this will succeed. I think it is a misreading of Venezuelan politics. I'm not not an advocate for Nicolás Maduro or his regime, or an apologist for the chicanery that it has exercised in elections. But the fact is that there is a 4.5 million man armed militia in Venezuela, which has been mobilized against a possible invasion or a coup attempt. And the fact is that you don't have a 4.5 million man militia armed if you're not confident of your position in power and your authority. So I think the United States and the Cuban American opponents of Venezuela are misreading Venezuelan politics. That's not to say that something might not happen. It could. And I must say, we have to acknowledge that the Chavista Maduro government in Venezuela has been inept, incompetent, repressive, and there have been an enormous number of Venezuelans who have voted with their feet to leave the country, not just to the United States, but to places like Chile, which is a democracy of great reputation, and which has been open to them, and Peru and Ecuador and Colombia, of course, the neighbor of Venezuela, but many Venezuelans who come here. And so this is also bound up in the Trump administration's xenophobia and campaign against illegal immigrants or people with a status other than legal admission. Many Venezuelans in the United States have been here as a result of gaining political asylum, but that is a temporary status. And we've seen now all sorts of wild charges about their involvement in drugs and criminal gangs and so forth, and their deportation without due process, any judicial review, or despite judicial review, first to what is basically a concentration camp in El Salvador. It is we have outsourced a concentration camp in El Salvador. People are talking about doing the same in other places, whether Libya or South Sudan or Somalia or whatever, all the places that the Israelis purport to want to evict Palestinians to if they don't murder them first.
Let's maybe talk just a little bit about that. How are you interpreting this move now by Israel to occupy Gaza City? Is this just the latest move in the genocide, which now also a UN report again confirms that it is, or does it actually have a military strategic rationale?
No, it has no military strategic rationale. It's part of an effort by Zionism, which has gone back before the founding of the State of Israel, 1947-48. It has its roots in the Zionist desire to turn Palestine into a land without people for people who didn't have land. That is, an invented people, because Judaism is a religion, and Jewish communities were religious communities. They were not a nationality. Zionism is a variant on Eastern European nationalism, ethno-linguistic nationalism, which produced self-determination for Eastern European countries, the creation of countries like Czechia and Slovakia and so forth, Hungary, out of an imperial context which was not ethno-linguistic. And from the very beginning, Zionists, even though the founders of Zionism were not religious and did not believe in God, they nonetheless claimed that God had given them this land. Of course, God had given it to the children of Abraham, one of whom was the father of the Arabs. But that's neither here nor there. So this has become a perversion of Judaism. I think it is just as much a heresy of cruelty as ISIS is a heresy of cruelty of the religion of Islam, which is very fine, which has 2 billion adherents on the planet and a very distinguished tradition of ethical reasoning. Judaism has a similar older tradition of ethical reasoning, but this has been completely abandoned in Israel. And I am seeing more and more Jews abroad, not in Israel, saying, Zionism preserves the rituals of Judaism, but it is fundamentally opposed to the genius of Judaism, which is the pursuit of justice and through ethical reasoning. And I, as a Jew, I'm quoting friends, don't want to be in any way associated with this. It is an insult to my religious heritage, and it's no more Christian than Nazism was Christian, even though it occurred in a Christian country.
It's quite a perversion. You're absolutely right. And Jeffrey Sachs is one of the Jewish great American intellectuals who said exactly what you just reproduced. And it's quite ridiculous. I mean, the way that Judaism is appropriated in order to implement this ethno-nationalist genocidal cause. If we look at how Marco Rubio, your Secretary of State, now again went to Israel and put on the, what is it called? And went to the Western Wall and did the prayers. And he's a Christian. I mean, this is purely implementing a show, a religious show, for the purpose of propaganda. And a colleague that I had on this channel recently pointed out that besides this Jewish lobby, though, that the United States has, there's also this element of Christian evangelism that actually has a religious belief and reason to support Israel. He judges this to be also quite important inside the U.S. political process for the influence of Israel. Do you agree with that, or how do you see it?
Yes and no. Let's be very clear. The Israel lobby depends on bribing or threatening to bribe or use money to oppose American politicians. We've just seen examples of this. We now know that the assassination of Charlie Kirk, an young American radical reactionary spokesman. I don't use the word conservative because he wasn't trying to conserve anything. He was trying to change things. That his assassination was preceded by vituperation from his Zionist backers, billionaire backers. He was funded by them. That it included an offer of, I believe it was $6 million in funds from Prime Minister Netanyahu if he would just shut up, because he was active on American campuses, which are now temperamentally very critical of Zionism, despite the effort to repress the criticism. And the kids he was talking to were winning him over. He was becoming ever more critical himself of Zionism and what it was doing in the Holy Land and other areas. And so he was actually afraid not only for his funding base, but for his life. And there is now a right-wing sponsored conspiracy, which I don't believe at all, but it's out there, that he was killed by Mossad. And this has been sufficiently disturbing to Israel that Prime Minister Netanyahu has come out and publicly denied that was the case. Of course, I have to say that nobody now believes anything Prime Minister Netanyahu says, so this probably adds credibility to what is probably a spurious conspiracy theory. Anyway, we are, the evangelical base is there, and ironically, of course, their thesis is that if the temple is rebuilt, replacing the Al-Aqsa Mosque atop the the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and in Revelations, apparently, there's some mention of a red heifer having to be involved in this, a heifer being a calf, female cow. And that then the rapture will come upon us. The end of days will emerge. All the Jews will be either exterminated or forced to become Christian. And the devout Christians will be swept up to heaven. This is the theory. Okay, so here's a theory that is pro-Zionist but anti-Semitic, and it is a remarkable. It's a commentary on how convoluted all this has become, and the Israelis and their cohort, their fifth column, basically in the Western world, whether in France or Germany or the United States or Britain, respond to any criticism of Israel by denouncing whoever said it as anti-Semitic. And basically they have cheapened the term to such, anti-Semitism is a horror, and it deserves to be regarded as such. But they have cheapened the term to such an extent that anti-Semitism, which used to mean someone who hated Jews, now means someone that some Jews hate and want to silence. So it's reversed. And we've seen the same thing with other terms. Terrorist now means an opponent of the Israeli occupation and genocide. So if you demonstrate in London, I mistook the other day, I mistook an anti-immigration Islamophobic demonstration for a pro-Palestinian one. A Palestine Action, a group that is committed to the human rights of Palestinians, has been branded a terrorist organization. And so there are now hundreds of thousands of English people who are technically, legally branded as terrorists because they oppose genocide. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up, really.
It's utterly Orwellian, and it's plainly Orwellian that in the sense that millions and tens of millions of people around the world, actually billions, see it, right? Anyone following the news about Europe who's not inside this very, very tiny bubble actually understands that this is just an abuse of all and any principles that the West has been touting out. But maybe that's the way also for us to spend the last 10 minutes on this bizarre narrative, maybe inside Europe, about the war in Ukraine. Where we see another one of these instances where the West constantly virtue signals about its intent to save Ukraine while it pushes Ukrainians into their early graves, into the bayonets of the Russians. But can you maybe tell us how you're seeing these peace negotiations or these efforts to come toward a resolution between Russia and the United States developing at the moment?
I don't think I can do that in 10 minutes.
Sorry.
Anyway, no, I think there are quite a number of things going on here. The double standards that have been applied to Israel and Ukraine, where every dead Ukrainian is extolled as a hero and a martyr, and every dead Palestinian is a number. Every Israeli who dies is a martyr, and every Palestinian who dies is a nobody. These double standards have done a great deal to dethrone the West from its position of moral dominance of the globe. The West doesn't make the rules anymore. Most of the world, the global majority, has no respect at all for the West, regards it as hypocritical and duplicitous. I mean, what can you say about a Western collective that says that forced assimilation in Xinjiang is genocide, but murdering people en masse in Gaza is not? So the West has lost its moral standing, and a large part of that is due to what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank. The West Bank, of course, is an untold story, but ethnic cleansing is at full play there. So That's the first thing. The second thing is, of course, the United States is now behaving like a rogue state rather than a supporter of the post-World War II order. For a brief time, we came up with an argument about the so-called rules-bound order, which had nothing to do with Bretton Woods and the NATO and the post-World War II Pax Americana. It was, we make the rules, we decide who they apply to. They don't apply to us, but you better obey. Rather than international law, which is a product of consensus. And so the United States is basically totally discredited. We have gone down into the mud with Israel, and I don't think we're going to get out. I don't think that in the future anyone is going to forgive either Israelis or Americans for our joint conduct of genocide. We were once an enabler of Israeli human rights abuses. Now we're a participant in them. That's what the Gaza Holocaust Foundation represents. It's what this grotesque plan for redeveloping Gaza as a resort area represents. Anyway, on Ukraine, Europeans, in my view, constitute what I call the coalition of the deluded. That is to say, they have no wherewithal with which to actually enable Ukraine to even defend itself effectively, let alone take back the territories it's lost. Their motive is anti-Russian, not pro-Ukrainian. They have put forward absolutely no peace proposal at all. Every proposal they put forward is a proposal to continue the war or escalate it. Now the United States has very cleverly handed off the Ukraine war to the Europeans. That is to say, Trump says, well, this wasn't my war. It's your war. But if you want to buy weapons from us that enrich our arms manufacturers, that's fine. We'll sell you the weapons and you can give them to Ukraine. And we'll make money and you can make war. And no, I think he generally does want to produce peace, but he has no idea what it is. So we have a lot of discussion about ceasefires, which are the consequences of peace, not a substitute for it. There are three issues which the Russians have very clearly posed from the beginning. One is the status of Russian speakers and other minorities in Ukraine, whether they will have the rights that the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe requires, and the rights that your own Austrian neighbors accepted in the 1955 Austrian State Treaty, which allowed speakers of Italian, Hungarian, Slovenian, and other languages to have cultural and linguistic autonomy, something like the Québécois in France, in Canada rather. I know the French aspire to make it part of France again. So that's the first issue. The second and more important issue is, what is the security architecture in Europe, and does it include forward deployment of anti-Russian forces on the Russian border? And that means the incorporation of Ukraine into NATO, followed by and accompanied by the deployment of offensive weaponry directed at Russia on Ukrainian soil, which is unacceptable for the same reasons that the presence of the Soviet Union and missiles in Cuba was unacceptable to the United States in 1962. And the third issue is, of course, the broader question of whether we can come up with a security architecture in Europe that reassures Russia against Western aggression and that reassures the West against Russian aggression. And that requires an extended conversation. You can't do this kind of thing at a flashy summit in Anchorage, Alaska. You can't do it. You can't have a summit that works without a lot of Sherpas preparing to climb up the mountains. And none of this is done. And here I come at last to what I think, as an American diplomat, retired, I deplore the most, and that is that my country no longer does diplomacy. That means that we have neither a policy process that integrates strategy, political and military, economic. We have no strategy, and we have gutted the Department of State. We've eliminated the U.S. Agency for International Development. We are no longer seen as a benign force internationally. We're seen as a bully, and we behave that way. And so that is very ineffective. And I think you can see this in the UN General Assembly vote to condemn Israel, and that is 10 votes against. The United States, Argentina, Mr. Millet appears to have some confusion. Like you mentioned, Vice President Vance. He's a Christian, but a very wobbly one. He's been a Catholic, a Mormon. Now he's back as a Catholic, supposedly. I have no idea what his views on Judaism are. He's married to a Hindu. I don't think religion is a major motivation for his behavior. Millet may be more complicated, but Millet is very drawn to Judaism and made that very clear, and very much Zionist. Viktor Orban, common cause with Netanyahu because he's likes autocracy, and they have other things in common. And then a ragtag group of many states. Of course, Israel voted against it. And I think in the UN General Assembly that we're now seeing, after the blatant Israeli violation of Qatari sovereignty and its actions to end any effort at negotiating peace in Gaza, the mediation role of the Qataris is over. We've now seen a meeting in Doha, which brought together almost all the members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And I think they're going to be very active now, not just passive in the United Nations. Yeah. And I think they will go after Israel in several ways. One, of course, is justifying, possibly in suspending Israeli membership in the United Nations, as was done in the case of South Africa, over a far less vicious version of apartheid than Israel now practices. And second, exploring the possibility of a Uniting for Peace resolution. And third, because the Palestinian delegation was denied visas to come to the UN General Assembly, despite the headquarters agreement, considering whether to relocate the United Nations, initially to Geneva maybe, and possibly to somewhere else, maybe in Asia, which has emerged as the center of global politics and economics. So I think a lot of things are in motion now. And all of this traces back to misbehavior by the Israelis, backed by the United States.
Very last footnote I would like to ask you about, because you said you deplore the fact that the United States doesn't do diplomacy anymore. And I had 3 European ambassadors on my program recently, and they said exactly the same about Europe. And they actually, the conclusion that we reached in that discussion was that a large part of that is due to the securitization of diplomacy, of outsourcing diplomatic activities to the Departments of Defense, to the intelligence agencies, who do all of the foreign policy analysis and reports and so on, instead of state and the actual diplomats. Would you subscribe to that statement for the US, or was it a different process?
No, I think that's very much part of the problem. But there's a more fundamental conceptual problem, and that is after many decades of Cold War and anti-Russian division in Europe, neither the United States nor Europeans have retained the capacity to reason strategically. Right. We didn't have to, because we had a strategy of containment, which George Kennan defined, which was very successful, but which defined our basic policies and our relationships everywhere. I mean, the Cold War was essentially a contest between two feudal overlords. Everybody defined their relationship, their themselves in the global context by which overlord they had a relationship with or not. And we had a non-aligned effort to have a relationship with neither overlord. But that wasn't very influential in the end. We lost the capacity to reason in a strategic sense. That's the first thing. Second, the Kennan proposal for containment was initially diplomatic, was not military, but it evolved to become a military and intelligence effort. And our institutions, those institutions flourished, as did the military-industrial complex, and the idea of using some measures short of war or military intervention or coercion to gain safety, security for the country disappeared. And there's a last thing in the case of the United States, which is in a unique position given our geography. We have two great oceans dividing us from possible enemies. We have no enemies in the Western Hemisphere, really. So when the Cold War ended, we determined that diplomacy, foreign policy in general, was a discretionary activity. You could do it or not, as you chose. Or to put it a different way, during John F. Kennedy, when he was president, said something like, if I make a mistake in domestic affairs, it can embarrass me, but if I make a mistake in foreign affairs, it could kill us all. Therefore, you have to be very serious about foreign policy. Well, after the Cold War, we weren't serious about foreign policy. We had various ideological impulses, democratize the Middle East and so forth and so on. And very infeasible thoughts, unrealistic thoughts, and in fact, in many cases, hypocritical. So we are now living with the consequences of those trends: conceptual deficit, strategic oblivion, tactical ineptitude. And we basically destroyed some of the institutions that successfully brought us prosperity. I would argue that in the case of the United Nations, what is worth preserving is the rules, the international law, the UN Charter, not the institution. And that the institution has to be replaced as the League of Nations was. It can build on what the UN has accomplished. But I want to end actually with a final thought, and that is, I think it's a complete nonsense to charge that the global majority, the Chinese, the Indians, the Russians, and everybody else are trying to overthrow the world order, or that they are revisionist. They are not. They are trying to restore the world order of the World Trade Organization, of the UN Charter, of international law, which has been destroyed by us. They are conservatives in the sense that they want to conserve things. Of course, they want to improve them too. There will be minor tweaks. But I think it's very notable that every institution that's been created by these rising and resurgent powers, take the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, for example, has not been a competitor or a repudiation of its Bretton Woods predecessors. They follow the same rules. Actually, in some ways, they're a little better. If you want to get funding for a project at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and you're a company, you can bid even if your nationality is not a member of the bank. That is not the case with the World Bank. Same thing with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS. These are fora. These are meeting places where policy issues can be openly debated without fear of obstruction by the Security Council. And the Security Council obviously does not represent the current constellation of power. It represents the victors of World War II, and it excludes countries like Japan, like India, like Germany. Europe is overrepresented. It does not have Brazil, and there's no Arab representative. Africa is not guaranteed a voice. This is outmoded, and it doesn't work. And so I think what we're seeing is a trend toward the invention of new institutions, which will try to carry on the values of the old ones that have been perverted.
This is a very hopeful interpretation, and I actually share it. I see it like that too, and I thank you very much for giving us your piece of clarity in these difficult times. Ambassador Chas Freeman, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Pascal. Let's hope that it is the saying is right. It's always darkest before the dawn.
It will dawn soon. Thank you, Ambassador.